The letter was folded in four, tucked between the pages of an old ledger that no one else ever opened. The ledger had a worn leather cover, its page edges yellowed by time, and sat on the second shelf from the left, between a spine-bare dictionary and a volume of state laws that Master Arthur Brantley had likely never cracked open. It was the kind of place where people hide what they don't want found, trusting that the mundane protects better than any padlock. No one searches where there seems to be nothing. Louisa found it on a Tuesday morning while dusting the shelves of the big house's library. Her fingers touched the paper before her eyes saw it, and when she unfolded it, as the letters began to organize themselves before her, and the meaning of each word took shape in her mind, the dusting cloth slipped from her hand without her noticing. Louisa stood frozen there, upright between the bookshelves with the paper open in front of her face, and read. She read it again. For a third time, slower, her heart racing and her hands trembling, because what was written on that paper, if it were true, if Master Arthur Brantley knew it existed, would change everything. For everyone. For her. For old Ben. For the children sleeping down in the slave cabins. For every man and woman who woke before the sun on that plantation and laid down long after the stars were high. Louisa looked at the library door. It was open, and the hallway outside was empty. She folded the letter slowly, tucked it inside her bodice close to her chest, and went back to dusting as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, and what she didn't yet know was how much that letter was going to cost her. Before we continue, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. We bring to life the memories and voices that never had a space, but which carry the wisdom of entire generations. The story you are about to hear is not about a piece of paper. It's about what happens when a woman who wasn't supposed to know how to read discovers a truth that powerful men preferred to bury. Hopewell Plantation sat in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, a good 12 miles from the nearest town. Nestled among flatlands covered in cotton fields that stretched so far, they sometimes vanished into the morning fog. It was 1852, and King Cotton ruled those lands. Master Arthur Brantley had arrived at the plantation 8 years earlier, after the death of the former owner, a woman named Miss Cecilia Marsh, who had no living children, and left everything she owned in a will kept by her lawyer up in Richmond. What exactly that will said, no one on the plantation knew for sure. What was known was that Master Arthur had arrived with a power of attorney, with papers signed by judges, bearing the smile of a man who had won before the game even started, and had taken possession of Hopewell as if he'd been born there. Louisa was 22 when the master arrived. She had been on the plantation her whole life, born in the slave quarters to a mother who died when she was 6, and raised in the shadow of Miss Cecilia, who had a good sort of strangeness, the habit of speaking to the enslaved as if they had ears and intelligence, for the simple reason that they did. It was Miss Cecilia who taught Louisa to read. It was a Thursday afternoon, when Louisa was 12 and sweeping the hall near the library, that the missus called her in and pointed to a chair with a conspiratorial smile. "This stays between us," she had said. And it did. 3 years of hidden afternoons, of whispered syllables, of words fitting together like well-crafted pieces of wood. When Miss Cecilia died, Louisa could read better than many free men in the county, but she had also learned something else, more important than letters, that knowing something and showing that you know it are two completely different things, and sometimes the latter can get you killed. Under Master Arthur Brantley, Hopewell became a plantation like so many others in the deep south. Backbreaking work in the cotton fields from before dawn until after dusk. Swift punishment with the whip for anyone who fell behind. Mandatory silence near the big house. Master Arthur was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and short-tempered, who always wore a wide-brimmed planter's hat and spoke in commands, even when he seemed to be conversing. His wife, Miss Penelope, was a woman with a drawn expression and hands always folded in her lap. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't kind either. She was just distant, like someone looking at the world through a window and never remembering to clean the glass. They had a son, Leo Brantley, who had been sent up to Boston to study law when he was 16 and hadn't returned since, except for Christmas holidays, when he would show up in well-tailored suits, looking at the plantation like someone viewing something they recognized but no longer fully knew. Louisa was 28 in July of 1852 when she found the letter. She had been a house slave for 3 years, after the previous one fell ill and never recovered. She worked inside the big house, washing, ironing, tidying, serving the table, and did it all in silence with her eyes cast down and her ears wide open, because Miss Cecilia had taught her something else besides reading. The invisible hear everything. Down in the quarters, Louisa was different. There she spoke, laughed when there was cause to laugh, looked after the little ones while their mothers worked the fields, and listened to old Ben tell stories of Africa with a voice that seemed to rumble from deep within the earth. Old Ben was past 60, with hands that had forgotten more trades than most men would learn in a lifetime. He had been a blacksmith by trade, a midwife by necessity, a counsellor always. And he was the only one besides Louisa who knew she could read, guarding that secret with the same care he guarded everything that mattered, without making a fuss, without boasting, just keeping it safe. The letter was from Miss Cecilia's lawyer, a man named Mr. Miller, written in his own hand and addressed to Master Arthur Brantley. It was dated 4 years prior, and what it said in legal jargon mixed with poorly disguised urgency was this: the original will of Miss Cecilia Marsh had been located in the courthouse after years of searching by legitimate heirs, and in that will, Miss Cecilia had made clear her intention that every enslaved man and woman on Hopewell Plantation be granted their free papers upon her death. The power of attorney Master Arthur used to seize the plantation was of questionable validity, and there was a lawsuit underway in the capital that could invalidate the transfer of property. Mr. Miller urgently requested that the master present himself to address the matter before the lawsuit progressed. The letter was 4 years old and had never been answered, and it had been hidden in a ledger no one ever opened. This discovery would have consequences that Louisa would only begin to grasp days later, when she realized the letter wasn't there by accident, but because someone had intentionally hidden it, and that person still walked the halls of the big house every day. Louisa spent the following week in a silence within her silence. She did her chores, served the meals, ironed the master's shirts, listened to Miss Penelope complain about yellowing pillowcases, agreed without a word, and returned to the quarters when the evening bell rang, lying in her corner with open eyes staring at the wooden ceiling. The letter was hidden inside the lining of her blanket. She knew keeping it was dangerous. She knew throwing it away was dangerous. She knew, above all, that letting anyone find out she had read it was a death sentence. Because if Master Arthur knew Louisa could read, the immediate question would be what else she had read, and the answer could mean the end of many things, starting with her life. Old Ben noticed on the second night. Ben possessed that rare quality of folks who have lived long enough to learn that what goes unsaid carries as much weight as what is spoken. He had survived the middle passage in the belly of a ship, and in the years that followed, he had done something few enslaved people managed to maintain long enough to forge their character. He kept observing. The sky, the crops, the growing children, the dying elders. It wasn't book wisdom. It was the wisdom of attention. And it was that gaze that settled on Louisa on that second night, and knew before a single word was uttered that something had shifted. He always knew. He sat beside her beneath the grand old oak tree at the edge of the quarters, its roots sprawling across the dirt like a giant's fingers, and stayed quiet for a time, listening to the crickets and the breeze. "You found something," he said finally, not phrasing it as a question. Louisa looked at him. The old man had the eyes of someone who had seen so much he lived on the other side of astonishment, in a place beyond surprise. She told him everything in a low whisper, the words tumbling out slowly like water over stone, and when she finished, Ben stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And now you know what Miss Cecilia wanted for us?" Louisa nodded. "And you know what the master did with what she wanted?" She nodded again. "The question," Ben said, his voice dropping even lower, "is what you gonna do with what you know?" Louisa didn't sleep that night. She lay with her eyes open, listening to the breathing of the folks around her, the creaking of the cabin's old timber, the wind that whistled through the cracks bringing a dry chill that bit the skin. She thought of Miss Cecilia. She thought of the afternoon the lady had called her into the library, long before it was Master Arthur's library, back when it was a sunlit room smelling of the dried lavender the former owner hung in the corners. Remember what she told me that first afternoon, Louisa thought in the dark. She had said, "A woman who can read is never completely without resources," and then she added, with that smile hiding a secret, "But a woman who can read and knows when not to show it, she is invincible." Louisa had been 11 when she heard that, and hadn't fully understood. She was 28 now, and she understood every single syllable. The carriage arrived the next morning. It was a Monday in July, the sky clear and the dry chill cutting through the dawn mist. Leo Brantley stepped out of the buggy, holding a leather satchel, wearing an expression Louisa couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the Christmas holiday look, that blend of boredom and courtesy. It was something else. He was older, 23 years etched into the corners of his eyes, and he carried his law degree papers under his arm, like someone who hadn't yet decided what to do with them. Master Arthur came down the porch steps to greet his son with a handshake that nearly turned into an embrace. Miss Penelope appeared in the doorway with the closest thing to a smile she could muster, and Louisa stood in the corner holding a serving tray, invisible as always, watching. Leo glanced at her once, a quick, distracted look, the kind people give the wallpaper, and returned his attention to his father. Louisa lowered her eyes and went inside. Over the next few days, Leo Brantley lingered on the plantation without any clear reason why. Master Arthur assumed his son had come to rest after years of schooling, and this convenient assumption hung in the air like truth because no one dared call it a lie. Leo didn't correct his father, and Louisa, who had learned to observe before concluding, noticed in those first weeks a methodical nature to the young man's steps, an organization that wasn't tourism or boredom, but a survey. He walked with the eyes of an auditor, counting windows, noting cracks, measuring distances with his strides without seeming to measure anything at all. She didn't yet know what it meant, but she knew it meant something. Master Arthur circled his son like a man wanting to ask a question, but not knowing how to phrase it. Miss Penelope ordered coffee and biscuits brought out with exaggerated frequency, as if feeding was her only known form of communication. Leo, for his part, walked the grounds. He walked a lot. He rose early, strolled through the cotton fields with his hands behind his back, paused to watch the labor, and asked Overseer Cyrus questions with a formality the overseer didn't know how to handle. Was it study, curiosity, or an inspection? No one knew for sure. But something shifted the day Leo walked into the library. Louisa was in there. She had gone to fetch a candlestick, Miss Penelope requested, and had lingered, as she always did, 2 minutes longer than necessary by the bookshelves. In those 2 minutes, without thinking, as naturally as drawing breath, she had pulled out a small volume of poetry, opened it to a random page, and was standing there reading, candlestick in her left hand, book in her right, when the door opened. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the entire world of Hopewell Plantation fundamentally changed in ways neither of them could yet measure. Leo stood frozen in the doorway. Louisa didn't lower the book. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Leo stepped inside, closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and stared at her with an expression Louisa couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger. It wasn't outrage. It was something she had never seen on a face belonging to the big house. Genuine curiosity. "You can read," he said. It wasn't a question. Louisa considered denying it, considered pretending she had picked up the book without knowing what it was, considered the 1,000 ways people try to erase what has just been witnessed. But there was something in Leo's gaze, something that wasn't a threat, and she replied, with a steady voice that surprised even herself, "I can." Leo crossed his arms and watched her for a moment. "Who taught you?" "Miss Cecilia," Louisa answered. Leo nodded slowly, as if that answer fit perfectly into a larger puzzle he was already assembling. And then, before she could brace herself, he asked, "You found something in the library, didn't you?" Louisa's heart stopped. What she didn't know was that Leo had come to the plantation for the exact reason she had found that letter. During his years up north, there was a lecture Leo couldn't forget. An estate law class. A professor with a droning voice talking about invalidated wills, contested powers of attorney, and the deliberately erased wishes of the dead. It was abstract, hypothetical. But Leo had felt the specific unease of someone recognizing that a hypothetical situation wasn't hypothetical at all. He lacked details. He lacked proof. He only had the unease, like a grain of sand in his shoe, too uncomfortable to ignore, too small to declare. He waited to finish his degree, got his diploma, and came back. Louisa stood there for a long moment. Leo didn't move, just waited, possessing the patience of someone who has learned that silence is also information. She could deny it. She could claim ignorance. She could change the subject, lower her eyes, go back to being invisible. But in that moment she recognized a choice because old Ben had spoken of it under the oak tree. There are times when fear protects you, and times when fear destroys you, and knowing the difference is everything. She looked at Leo Brantley and saw a young man with a law degree, son of a planter who had stolen an estate with shady papers, but beneath that she saw someone who had asked the right question. "I found a letter," she said. What followed was a conversation Louisa had never had with anyone from the big house. A talk between equals, pretending not to be equals, because the walls had ears and the ears had masters. Leo sat in the armchair behind the desk. Louisa remained standing, as was expected, but spoke with a firm voice which was not expected. She described the letter, the lawyer's name, the date, the contents. Leo listened with his elbows on the desk, hands steepled over his face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long stretch. Then he said, "I suspected as much." Suspected what? The will. The way my father took over this place. I was in Boston when it happened, just 16, but things didn't add up. There was a gap in the papers he showed me years later. I came back to find that gap. Louisa looked at him. "Did you know about the lawyer's letter?" "I didn't know it existed, but I knew something like it had to." "What's the difference?" Leo thought about it. "Maybe none, or maybe everything." He stood, walked to the window and stared down at the yard where 2 enslaved men were hauling sacks of cottonseed. "With all due respect, sir," Louisa said carefully, "what Miss Cecilia wrote in her will, the free papers, that was her dying wish. And someone hid the lawyer's letter right here in this library." Leo turned around. "I know who hid it," he said, and Louisa saw in his eyes that he truly knew, and that the knowledge weighed on him in a way she couldn't measure, because bearing the weight of an empire built on injustice feels different when the injustice was committed by your own flesh and blood. "You need time," she finally said. Leo looked at her, surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to offer that. "I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm saying you need to think, because whatever you do with this information is going to affect a whole lot of folks, not just the people in the quarters, your mother, yourself." Leo remained silent. Louisa picked up the candlestick she had forgotten on the shelf. "Excuse me, sir," she said, slipping out of the library with her heart pounding so fiercely she had to lean against the hallway wall just to remember how to breathe. That night in the slave quarters, Louisa told Ben what had happened. The old man listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the low fire burning in the center of the yard, and when she finished he asked, "You think he's going to do something about it?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But he didn't turn me in." "That's something, all right," Ben said. "Sometimes, Louisa, the silence of a man who could have destroyed you and didn't is the first sign of a change that doesn't even know it's started yet." She stared into the flames for a while. "And if Master Arthur finds out the letter exists, then it comes down to who gets to the lawyer first," Ben said, "him or the young master. And if neither does anything, then somebody's going to have to, Louisa." In the days that followed, something shifted in Leo's demeanor. He still walked the plantation, but now his strides had a direction they lacked before. He would stop to talk with the field hands, not barking orders but conversing, and the initial replies were brief, suspicious, the guarded looks of people who've learned that a master's curiosity is never free. But Leo, fresh from the north with new eyes, had patience. He would sit by the dirt paths bordering the cotton fields and ask questions: how the harvest was going, if the well water was sweet, if the children were coming down with the fever. Overseer Cyrus watched this with mounting tension, but didn't know how to intervene without looking like he was defying the master's son. And when Master Arthur caught wind of it, he summoned his son into his study behind closed doors. Leo emerged with a dark scowl, refusing to speak a word to anyone. Louisa saw it all. And that day, seeing Leo leave his father's office with that expression, she understood a war was brewing inside the big house, one just as silent and violent as anything that had ever happened out in the yard. And in this war she was, without ever asking to be, a central piece. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Master Arthur Brantley called everyone on the plantation into the main yard. That decision would have consequences no one present could have foreseen. Nearly 50 souls stood gathered beneath the July sun, the cotton fields still in the distance, Overseer Cyrus standing beside the master with his arms crossed. The master announced that an important document had gone missing from his library, that someone had snooped where they didn't belong, that he was going to find out who it was. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that was more terrifying than a shout, because it meant he had already decided on the punishment and was merely going through the motions. His eyes swept over the crowd, and when they landed on Louisa, they stopped. "You," he said, "you clean the library." Louisa's stomach dropped. She kept her eyes glued to the dirt. "Yes, master. Have you seen anything unusual these past few weeks? Anything out of place?" Louisa felt the weight of every stare in that yard. She felt the glare of Overseer Cyrus. She felt old Ben's gaze from the corner, steady and calm. She felt the eyes of Leo Brantley, who stood near the porch, as still as a stone. "No, master," she lied. "I ain't seen nothing out of place." The master stared at her for a long time. The kind of look that tries to pry open your skull and rummage around inside. Then he moved his eyes to the next person. The tension in the yard didn't fade, it merely shifted. Louisa kept her eyes down and her hands clasped in front of her, and only God knew what was happening inside her chest in that moment. That night, tears flowing freely, Louisa wept for the first time since finding the letter. She cried softly, facing the cabin wall, her face buried in the blanket where the letter no longer hid. She had moved it to a safer spot, inside a hollow rock behind the quarters that only she and Ben knew about. She cried not from fear, though fear was certainly there. She cried because she understood that the letter was proof of a promise, proof that Miss Cecilia had cared about them, had wanted to give them something, and that this promise had been deliberately buried. And she, Louisa, was now the sole guardian of that promise, a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. The next day, Leo sought her out. He went to the kitchen where she was sorting beans and asked her to fetch a specific book from the library. She went. He was already there. He shut the door. "My father suspects you," he said bluntly. "I know," she replied. "You can't keep the letter here." "I know that too." Leo fell silent for a moment. "Louisa, I wrote to Mr. Miller, the lawyer. I explained the situation and he replied, 'The lawsuit is still active, the will is legally binding. But to take effect, the court needs the original letter as proof my father knew about the litigation and willfully ignored it.'" Louisa stared at him. "You're asking me for the letter?" "I am." "What exactly for?" "To take it to the courthouse. To advance the lawsuit. If the suit advances, the free papers will have to be honored," he said. "And the deed to the plantation will be reviewed." Louisa stayed quiet for a long stretch. "If you do this, what happens to you? To your father? To this land?" Leo looked out the window. "My father will lose the case. The plantation might be returned to Miss Cecilia's estate. I could be appointed the legal administrator, depending on how the trial goes, meaning I'd be in charge of the property while the legal matters settle. But my father will hate me forever." "And you'd lose your father to gain what?" Louisa challenged him. "My conscience," he said. "Well then, with all due respect, sir," Louisa said carefully, "I need more than your conscience. I need to know you're going to see this through to the end." Leo Brantley was quiet for a very long moment. The July sun poured through the library window, painting a bright stripe across the floorboards between them. Leo stared at that stripe of light, then at Louisa. "I will," he swore, "but you have to trust me." The person he was asking for trust was a black woman who had been taught from infancy that trust always comes with a price tag, that the price fluctuates, that sometimes the price is everything you have. She thought of old Ben. She thought of Miss Cecilia. She thought of the folded paper inside the hollow rock, and she said, "I trust you, but know that if you back down halfway, it's going to be worse than if you never started at all." Leo nodded. He knew that. The longest, quietest moment Louisa lived that year was what came next. The morning Leo Brantley drank his coffee on the veranda with his father as if it were just an ordinary day, then went to his room, gathered his papers, called the stables for a horse, and rode off toward town. Master Arthur watched him leave and didn't ask where he was going, because Master Arthur never asked where anyone was going. He had learned that asking questions proves a lack of control, and he was always in control. But that morning, there was a crucial difference he failed to grasp. A son riding off with papers the father hadn't vetted, heading toward a town that had a post office with lines straight to Richmond. The crisis erupted 6 days later, when an unfamiliar carriage rolled up the plantation drive. But before that, there was a morning etched into Louisa's memory with the specific clarity of things that seem mundane as they happen, but reveal their true gravity later. It was a Wednesday. The sun was low, painted the cold orange hue of a Delta winter. Louisa was at the well filling a bucket when she saw Master Arthur on the big house porch, gazing at the cotton horizon with his hands clasped behind his back. He was alone, as he frequently was these days. And in that silhouette, in that rigid posture, set against the pale sky, Louisa observed something she watched for a moment before dropping her eyes. Master Arthur Brantley was a man who had built a whole world on the absolute conviction that things worked a certain way, and his way was the right way. And now he stood facing the terrifying possibility that the foundations of his empire were quietly crumbling away. Louisa hoisted the heavy bucket and walked back to the kitchen with her usual measured steps. She didn't feel pity for Master Arthur Brantley. It would be a lie to say she did, but she felt something akin to the realization that every wrong has a face, and faces are easier to hate from afar than up close, though the wrong remains a wrong regardless of whose face it wears. Out of the carriage stepped a lean, well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Miller's representative, sent down from the capital on urgent business with Mr. Arthur Brantley. The master's face went white as chalk. He yelled for Leo. He called the overseer. He ordered the enslaved folk far away from the house. And during the 2 hours the lawyer's clerk sat in the plantation office, Louisa lingered just outside with a rag in her hand, pretending to polish the wainscoting, listening to the master's voice rise and crash like a storm that can't decide whether to break or blow over. Master Arthur emerged from that office wearing a look Louisa had never witnessed on his face. It wasn't rage. It was something older and heavier, the face of a man who realizes his armor is rusting straight through. He walked past her in the hall without seeing her. Louisa stood perfectly still, her heart hammering, the rag motionless in her grip. And then, at the end of the hall, Master Arthur Brantley stopped. He stood with his back to her for a second that dragged on far too long, and then he kept walking, without saying a word. The gathering Leo Brantley called that afternoon in the yard was unlike anything that had ever occurred on Hopewell. Leo stood in the exact spot his father had occupied days earlier, but his expression was different, and what he held in his hands was a sheaf of legal papers he gripped like delicate glass. Louisa stood among the others, invisible again, but this time by choice, because she had figured out that the invisible see the most, Leo explained, in the steady, measured cadence of a man who spent years learning how to project, that there was a legal process underway in the capital that could dramatically alter the legal standing of everyone present. He couldn't guarantee the final verdict, but he promised the lawsuit would be pursued to its absolute conclusion, and he warned that any retaliation against any person during this interim would carry severe consequences, which he personally would document and report to the court. Overseer Cyrus's jaw went slack. Miss Penelope hovered on the porch, looking as pale as a ghost who'd heard a bad rumor. Master Arthur didn't show his face. Old Ben, standing right beside Louisa, murmured so softly he didn't even turn his head. "You done good." And Louisa didn't answer. She just looked up at the sky above the cotton fields, where the winter clouds were breaking apart, revealing a blue underneath that looked infinitely deeper than it was. The lawsuit dragged on for 2 grueling years. 2 years during which Master Arthur woke up every single morning, knowing there were papers in a courthouse bearing his name, creeping toward a judgment he couldn't bully or buy off. And that knowledge altered the way he took up space in every room, every hour of the day, until he seemed to shrink, not in physical stature but in presence, like a flame that still burns, but throws no light. Miss Penelope, during this time, was the silent surprise nobody bet on. She didn't take her husband's side nor her son's. She anchored herself in a middle ground that wasn't neutrality, but rather the stance of a witness, someone who realizes the inevitable is coming and decides her only duty is to watch without fueling either fire. Some mornings Louisa would pass the missus in the hall, and the lady would look at her differently. Not the old look that slid off Louisa like she was a piece of furniture. It was a gaze that landed, that recognized her existence and then moved on in silence. Louisa never fully decoded what that look meant, but she knew it was different, and on a plantation, a difference was worth something. For 2 years, Hopewell Plantation existed in a bizarre limbo, like a grandfather clock whose pendulum got stuck mid-swing. Master Arthur didn't abandon the property, but he withdrew, avoiding people, choosing empty hallways and off hours to roam the house he used to command. Leo effectively took over the management, backed by Mr. Miller's legal authority, implementing changes that Overseer Cyrus obeyed with the tight-lipped scowl of a man who complies with his hands but rebels with his soul. The rations got better. The well was cleaned. A doctor from town was brought in to treat the children when the summer fever spiked. It wasn't everything, but it was more. Louisa kept working just the same, because work doesn't stop while the world decides what it wants to be. But something had fundamentally shifted in how she occupied those spaces. The other enslaved women looked at her in a way she couldn't quite put a name to, though she recognized it as a blend of respect and wariness. The way folks look at someone who holds a secret they don't, wondering if that knowledge is going to save them or ruin them. Ben, when she mentioned it one evening, just said, "Let 'em look. What matters is what you did with what you knew. And what you did, Louisa, was you refused to bury it. Most folks grab a shovel. You refused." The court's decision arrived on a crisp March morning, inside a thick envelope sealed with the wax crest of the Richmond courthouse. Master Arthur, Leo Brantley, and the lawyer's clerk locked themselves in the office for 3 straight hours. When the door opened, the master went directly upstairs to his bedroom and never came back down that day. Leo walked out to the yard. He didn't ring the bell, didn't shout. He just stood dead center in the dirt, looking around like a man searching for the right words. Louisa was near the wash house. She saw him. He saw her. And Leo walked straight toward her, the thick parchment gripped in his fist, and said in a voice meant only for her, "The judge upheld the will. The manumission papers are legally binding. It'll take some time to process the bureaucracy, but you're all free." Louisa stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and then, for the first time in years, she felt an emotion she couldn't neatly label, something akin to the moment the rain finally breaks after a crushing drought, the unmistakable feeling of the air shifting before the very first drop hits the dust. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. And packed into that brief sentence was the crushing weight of everything left unsaid. A thank you for the letter, for the lawsuit, for the library, for the day he chose not to condemn her when he held all the power to do so, for choosing the hardest possible road when the easy path was wide, comfortable, and cheap. Exactly as easy paths always are. Leo shook his head. "I'm the one thanking you. If you hadn't saved that letter, if you had burned it, if you'd kept your mouth shut when I cornered you in that room, none of this would be happening." Louisa looked at him with those eyes old Ben always claimed could see past tomorrow, eyes that had learned early on that what you project and what you are rarely align without costing you something, and that true wisdom is knowing exactly when to let the world see what's inside. "With all due respect, sir," she replied, "I kept the letter because Miss Cecilia taught me to read. And she taught me to read because she believed I was going to use it to do something important one day. I was just keeping faith." Leo fell silent. Then he offered something she never expected. "Louisa, when all the dust settles, I want you to know there's a place for you here. Not as property, but as—" He paused, searching for the right term. "As someone who belongs." Louisa met his eyes, and with a profound calm forged by a lifetime of having to stay composed when the world was anything but, she answered, "I know you mean well, sir. And that's a rare thing. But the place I want is my own, and I'm going to be the one to build it." Leo Brantley slowly nodded, and in that nod lay an understanding that would take years to fully mature, but which had definitively taken root in that moment. Old Ben passed away before he ever saw his free papers notarized by the clerk. He died on a mild September night at 72 years old, surrounded by the folks from the quarters. Louisa holding his weathered hand, his face carrying the peace of a man who walked a brutally long road, but never committed the ultimate cruelty of giving up. His final breath was given to Louisa. "You planted the seed," he rasped. "Now the harvest is coming." She let the tears run freely down her cheeks and made no effort to wipe them away, because some griefs demand not to be hidden, and losing the elder who teaches you who you are is chief among them. The following years moved slowly and loudly, exactly the way monumental change always moves. There were mornings Louisa woke up, and Hopewell looked exactly the same. The cotton needed picking, the laundry needed scrubbing, the sun rose and set in the exact same spots, and it took a conscious effort to remember that the very bedrock of the plantation had shifted, even if the surface looked unchanged. And there were other days when the difference struck you right in the chest, when a small child walked into the parlor that had been converted into a schoolroom and sat down with a brand new slate on her lap, when Leo Brantley actively asked Louisa's opinion on a farming decision and genuinely waited to hear her answer, when a formerly enslaved man or woman was handed their official free papers and stared at the document with a bewildered awe Louisa recognized intimately, having done the exact same thing herself. On those days, she understood that freedom isn't an event, but a painful, joyous process requiring the deep patience of those living inside it. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, stumbling, and starting over again. Hopewell Plantation was formally transferred to Leo Brantley as the rightful executor of Miss Cecilia's estate, while Master Arthur was given a financial settlement mandated by the judge. The older master departed the plantation on a rainy morning without any fanfare, nobody coming out to watch him leave except Miss Penelope, who followed him with her usual tight-lipped, distant expression. But as she reached the bottom step of the porch, she paused, glanced back at the big house, the yard, and Louisa, who happened to be walking by, and in the missus's eyes, Louisa saw neither pride nor regret, just the stark realization that the world had spun right on without asking for her permission. Leo managed the estate differently. Not perfectly, because perfection in that era and within that bloody framework was an impossibility, but differently in a way the workers felt in their bones long before their minds could articulate it. The manumission papers were processed one by one, plagued by the deliberate slowness the legal system imposed on black bodies, yet each one arrived carrying the profound weight of a document that permanently alters a human being's status in the registry of the world. Louisa received hers on a crisp October morning, 4 years after she had first touched the letter in the library. She held the parchment with both hands, read every single word with the eyes Miss Cecilia had unlocked 32 years prior, slowly folded it and tucked it into her dress right against her heart, in the exact same place she had hidden the letter that changed history. When folks asked if she was all right, Louisa smiled and said she was, and it was the truth, but it was a deeply complicated truth, exactly as hard-won truths always are. Louisa chose to stay at Hopewell as a free woman. She stayed because her people needed someone who could decipher legal jargon when they were handed contracts they couldn't read. She stayed because there were children she could teach exactly what Miss Cecilia had taught her. She stayed because formal liberty, she had quickly learned, is not the same as having a solid place in the world, and a place in the world is built over time by intentionally choosing where to plant your feet. In the spring of 1865, when the news of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached Hopewell via a crumpled newspaper brought by a traveler from town, Louisa was 44 years old and had taught 37 children how to read. She kept tally of that number with religious devotion. knowing every name, every face, every afternoon, spent with chalk, slates, and infinite patience. That number was her personal answer to the unspoken question Miss Cecilia had asked when she opened the library doors to a 12-year-old girl holding a dust rag. What good is knowledge if you don't pass it on? Upon seeing that crumpled piece of news, Louisa, now 44, stood still. She listened to Leo read the decree aloud in the yard for those who couldn't read it themselves, and stood in quiet reverence while all around her, men and women wept, hollered, fell to their knees, and hugged one another, letting the tears flow without an ounce of shame, because some victories demand to be wept over openly. Louisa remained quiet, hands folded in front of her, gazing up at the high, piercing blue sky of the Mississippi spring. She thought of old Ben. She thought of Miss Cecilia. She thought of the folded paper she had stumbled upon that Tuesday morning with a rag in her hand. She thought of Leo Brantley holding the court papers. She thought of every grueling step of every year between that day and this one. And then she smiled. A small, silent smile, the kind of smile that requires no audience whatsoever. That afternoon, she walked into the makeshift schoolroom in an unused wing of the house, where she taught 3 days a week, and picked up a piece of chalk. On the slate board, in careful, elegant cursive, she wrote the word, freedom. She stared at it for a moment. Then, directly underneath, in smaller letters, she wrote, and the price it costs. One of her students, an 8-year-old girl named Jurema, who was born 2 years after the initial free papers were issued, and thus had no memory of the whip or the chains, raised her small hand and asked, Miss Louisa, what's the price? Louisa looked at her, this beautiful child who was living proof that the world had finally pivoted, even if just a few degrees, and answered, the courage not to bury the truth when you find it. The little girl wrinkled her nose, struggling to understand. Louisa's smile grew wider. One day you'll understand, baby, she said softly, and she wiped the slate clean to begin the lesson. If you've listened to this story all the way through, then you know that profound change rarely comes from grand, sweeping gestures. It comes from a woman finding a piece of paper and choosing not to burn it. It comes from a young man choosing not to look the other way when the law gives him an excuse to do so. It comes from an old man dying with the peace of knowing he planted a seed that will outlive him. If this narrative touched you in any way, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear stories that truly matter. Leave a comment below telling us what the word courage means to you, because in times like ours, where we are still constantly forced to choose between what is comfortable and what is right, stories like Louisa's are far more than just history. They are a mirror. Hopewell Plantation morphed into many things over the ensuing decades. It became a dairy farm, then a subdivided property, then an overgrown ruin, and finally, it was paved over by a state highway no one asked for, but everyone had to accept. But the stories survived, whispered from generation to generation. The legend of the enslaved woman who knew how to read, who uncovered the buried proof of a promise, and who had the terrifying bravery to ensure that promise didn't die in the dark. Because some promises are simply too massive to stay hidden inside an old ledger nobody ever opens, and some women are just too great to remain invisible forever. And Louisa, the enslaved girl who learned her letters in secret and refused to bury the truth when she found it, eventually slept peacefully in the very earth she had helped change, her name written in the county registry for the first time as a fully free woman.